What was Benoit's backup plan today? He mentioned that if the communication with David Codd doesn't work, maybe Daniel Parent and I could have an earlier session. I was going to put that on my CV that I had to cover for David Codd, but that didn't work out. Anyways, this is joint work with Benoit Dosti. So different talks today, they highlighted to different extents the importance of labor market assimilation of immigrants. It's one of the main policy objectives and also one of the main challenges of a lot of countries that accept a large population of immigrants. There's extensive evidence in economics that suggests visible minority immigrants in Canada experience significant wage disparities with the Canadian counterparts, and white immigrants do not experience such significant wage gaps to the same extent as visible minority immigrants. There's also evidence regarding the decline in occupational mobility, so some type of occupational downgrading, if you want, upon arrival, and also some disadvantages they experience in terms of both inter-firm and intra-firm mobility. Some of the work that I've done with Andrew McGee at the University of Alberta looks at these mobility patterns and differences between immigrants and Canadian-borns, and what we find is that in terms of both inter-firm and intra-firm upward mobility, immigrants do face some disadvantages. So there are all these labor market frictions that affect immigrants in different ways, and we do have a fair amount of evidence that suggests a lot of this has to do with the discounting of immigrants' foreign credentials. The fact that returns to the foreign credentials tends to be smaller compared to their Canadian counterparts. Now, at the same time, there's sort of a separate literature that highlights the importance of job training as a main source of a skill formation and human capital accumulation. Heckman estimates that post-school investment, which mainly includes job training, accounts for more than half of one's human capital accumulation over a lifetime. There's also evidence that suggests training has significant impacts on worker productivity, some of the work that Benoit has done, on innovation, as well as wages and voluntary turnover. We also know that employers tend to spend a fair amount of money on these trainings. So it's estimated in 2014, Canadian employers on average spent $800 per employee for training. So these trainings are costly. So this highlights the importance of having access to training opportunity, especially for immigrants, in order to be able to activate their human capital and make them more compatible with the skill requirements of the host country. There's evidence that suggests receiving training could increase returns to the foreign credential, which is one of the main sources of all sort of disadvantages that they experience. And there's also evidence from Finland that suggests it could increase employment and earning opportunities of immigrants and reduce their reliance on social benefits. So basically what we do here is we explore the national representative Canadian data to look at differences between Canadian-borns and immigrants in access to training opportunities. We have very well-defined measures of training that we are going to exploit. One is formal classroom training, and the other one is informal on-the-job training. The other thing we are going to do is to distinguish between two different mechanisms that could drive any economy-wide differences in training opportunities between immigrants and Canadian-borns. You can imagine that there is one mechanism that could operate within workplaces, so it's within the same workplace that immigrants and Canadian-borns experience differences in the training opportunities. But even in the absence of any within workplace disparity, there could still exist an economy-wide difference in training opportunities between the two groups if there is disproportionate sorting of immigrants, say, into workplaces that are less training-oriented or on average offer fewer training opportunities, right? So there is, again, an extensive literature that documents the contribution of disproportionate sorting of natives and immigrants across firms to the, for instance, earning gaps that they experience. So we also want to distinguish between these two mechanisms here because they are clearly driven by different factors and they also have different policy implications. We're also going to examine if any differences that we find changed by years since immigration. So for those who have stayed longer in Canada, whether their experience is different. We're also going to look at differences by education level to proxy for a skill, because the skilled and unskilled immigrants sort of operate in quite different labor markets. In terms of potential explanations, we could provide some suggestive evidence. This is always the difficult part with observational data. So what we are going to look at is whether there are some potential differences in career path or hierarchical level that is sort of correlated with some unobserved differences in some unobserved characteristics between natives and immigrants, which drives these differences in training opportunities. We're also going to compare our results by looking separately at nonprofits versus for-profits. Now, the reason that we make this distinction is this came out of another work I did with Benoit, where we learned that there are significant differences in terms of gender disparities between the for-profits and nonprofits. So I'll actually talk more about that once we get to that section. The data we use is a linked Canadian employer-employee data. Is slightly different from the data sets that David and Feng use. It has some advantages and some disadvantages. It's an older data set. It's called Workplace and Employee Survey. We don't observe the population of all employees within firms. We only observe a random sample of employees from within each workplace, up to 24 employees. So that's one of the disadvantages. It's also a shorter panel. We also don't get to follow workers over time. We get to only follow workers for 1 year, and then in every other year there is a new sample of workers drawn. But the advantages of the West are the very rich set of variables that we have at our disposal, including all these training measures that we can exploit because it's survey data. So West is, in the West we can follow employers over time, so that allows us to implement models with fixed effects. And then for each employer, as I mentioned, there's a random sample of employees drawn in every odd year, and then these workers are followed for 1 year, and then in the next odd year there is a new sample of workers drawn. We use only data from odd years to avoid any sample selection problems associated with attrition between the first and the second interview. So we basically only use the first interview for each worker in our analysis. And our sample is restricted to non-Aboriginal workers between the ages of 24 and 65. Now, in terms of training measures that we are going to look at, we look at differences in probability of classroom training and on-the-job training. So in the West, there is a question that asks workers whether in the last 12 months they have received any classroom training related to their job, and it explains classroom training includes all training activities which have a predetermined format, including a predefined objective, a specific content, progress may be monitored and or evaluated. They also ask if they have received informal on-the-job training, and so this is a very helpful distinction that we can make, because in some of the other work that Benoit has done and other people, it's shown that classroom training has a much more significant impact on things like productivity, so because of the more structured nature. We also have measures on duration of training, so all workers who report that they received classroom training or on-the-job training. They also report the number of days they spent on on-the-job training or classroom training. Also for classroom training, workers report how many courses they have taken in the last 12 months. So we are going to use those measures to not only look at the probability of receiving training, but also the duration and intensity of training. So here are the first sort of results. We separately look at men versus women because there are significant differences. For instance, when we look at wage differences between natives and immigrants, there are significant differences between these two groups, especially when you focus on visible minority immigrants. We also distinguish between Canadian-borns and immigrants based on the ethnicity. So we categorize them into two groups, white immigrants and visible minority immigrants versus white Canadian-borns versus visible minority Canadian-borns. For those of you who are not familiar with the term visible minority, it's defined as those who are non-Caucasian in race and non-white in color, of course, excluding Aboriginals. And what you will see is that making that distinction is actually quite important. There are large differences between those groups. So each column here represents estimates from different models with different control variables. Our most preferred specification is column 6, where we have personal and job characteristics, sort of usual suspects that you have in most models. We also control for tenure, course, occupation, and industry. Now, of course, these are potentially endogenous, but as you see, adding these to the model does not change the results much, so we leave them in the model in the most preferred specification. Sort of, you can think of those as a more conservative estimate of these differences. And also, we estimate similar models, but include firm fixed effects. And it's the difference between the models that exclude fixed effects and include fixed effects that tells us to what extent disproportionate sorting of immigrants across firms with different training opportunities contributes to the economy-wide difference that we observe. Because if you think about it, in models with fixed effects, the identification comes from differences within firms, so that sort of isolates, removes, and ignores any disproportionate sorting of natives and immigrants across firms. So comparing these within workplace differences with the economy-wide differences from models without firm fixed effects gives us a measure of the contribution of sorting across firms to those differences. So if you look at the male sample, what you find, which is interesting, is that visible minority immigrants are significantly more likely to receive on-the-job training. That also highlights the importance of making the distinction, because had I combined visible minority Canadian-borns with white Canadian-borns, then you would have seen a much larger difference looking at visible minority immigrants and white immigrants. Then if you look at white immigrants, there's not much of a difference in probability of on-the-job training. Estimates are small and statistically indistinguishable from zero. And if you look at visible minority immigrants, the same thing. There's not much of a difference in the probability of on-the-job training. Looking at women, pretty much the same patterns emerge, except from the fact that for visible minority Canadian-borns, although the estimated coefficients are economically large, they're statistically insignificant. We find similar patterns when we look at duration of on-the-job training. So again, visible minority immigrants receive, on average, longer on-the-job training, while white immigrants and visible minority, well, actually, even for white immigrants, they also receive longer on-the-job training. Visible minority immigrants, however, receive shorter on-the-job training, but again, they are not statistically significant. So looking at on-the-job training, we don't find large differences that are also statistically significant in terms of probability and duration of on-the-job training. When we look at classroom training, however, that's where we start to observe significant differences. So again, if you look at the sample of men, look at the most preferred specification in column 6, similar to the on-the-job training results, you find that visible minority Canadian-borns are around 9 percentage points more likely to receive classroom training. For white immigrants, the estimates are smaller, statistically insignificant. When you look at visible minority immigrants, they are around 7 percentage points less likely to receive classroom training. Now, one interesting thing here is that if you look at the estimated coefficient from the model with firm effect, you see that there is basically no difference in probability of classroom training within firms. What that suggests, so comparing this coefficient from column 6 to this coefficient from column 9, what that suggests is that this entire economy-wide gap in probability of classroom training experienced by visible minority immigrant is driven by the disproportionate sorting, the crowding into firms that are less training oriented or offer, on average, fewer training opportunities. When you look at the sample of women, visible minority Canadian-borns now do not experience higher probability of receiving classroom training. When you look at women, for white immigrants, you get results similar to men. And again, for visible minority immigrant females, you get results that are similar to male visible minority immigrants. They again experience large differences in probability of receiving classroom training. Now, if you compare this coefficient here from the model that includes firm fixed effects, what you see is that there is still a significant gap in probability of receiving classroom training within firms experienced by female visible minority immigrants. So sort of half of the economy-wide gap they experience, which suggests for them the mechanism is a little bit different. So half of that economy-wide gap, that 8.6 percentage point difference, operates within firms, so differences within the same workplace. And the other half is due to the disproportionate sorting across firms. Now, we look at also the duration of classroom training. Similar to the previous results, we find that visible minority immigrant men also, and remember here the population is all those who received classroom training. So even for those visible minority immigrants who did receive classroom training, the classroom training that they received was shorter by 0.5 days. So comparing to the average number of classroom training received by white Canadian-borns, that's about 20% less. For women, you find a smaller effect and is statistically insignificant. When you also look at the number of courses taken by these different groups, again, you find similar results. Visible minority immigrant men receive fewer courses compared to white Canadian-borns. For women, again, the difference is not statistically significant, and it is a small. Part of the reason why we don't find as large a difference when we look at female visible minority immigrants versus male visible minority immigrants might have to do with the fact that here we are comparing female immigrants to female Canadian-borns. So female Canadian-borns are already in a sort of a disadvantaged position compared to male Canadian-borns. So that is partly why, even if you look at wage differences between female immigrants and Canadian-borns and wage differences between male immigrants and Canadian-borns, it's something between 30 to 50% smaller. So part of it, so this doesn't really have to do with the fact that these female visible minority immigrants are doing better than male visible minority immigrants. They are doing better in relative terms compared to the female counterparts. But in absolute terms, that's not really the case. If we compare all of them to the same group, which is white male Canadian-borns, they both do poorly. We also have another training measure that I did mention at the beginning. These employees are also asked if they received some sort of payment or help from their employer to take some type of career-related training outside paid working hours. And again, here what we find is that visible minority immigrants are less likely to receive payment or help from their employer to receive this type of training. Now, we also look at, people are also asked if in the last 12 months they were offered a training that they turned down. So what we find is that, in fact, white Canadian-borns are more likely to turn down training offers. In other words, visible minority immigrants are less likely to turn down training offers. So despite the fact that white Canadian-borns tend to turn down training offers at a higher probability, they are still receive, they still have a higher probability of receiving training, classroom training more specifically. We also look at how our results change by years since immigration. Now, here, of course, we cannot really distinguish between a cohort effect and an assimilation effect, to the extent that some of these observed characteristics we control for could pick up some of these changes in cohorts of immigrants over time. We might be able to control for some of that, but that we want to be cautious that we can't really distinguish between those two. What we find is that for visible minority immigrants, both less recent and more recent immigrants, those who have been in Canada for more than 10 years and less than 10 years, they basically experience similar differences in probability of classroom training. So you might expect that for those who have spent more time in Canada, they have accumulated more Canadian labor market experience. So then you might not expect to find, you might expect to find a smaller, actually larger differences in probability of training, but you would expect that those who have been in Canada for a shorter period of time, they probably are in more need of receiving training. So you would expect to see a smaller gap, but what you see is regardless of how much they spend in Canada, they still experience differences that are statistically indistinguishable from each other. We also look at differences by education level, sort of to proxy for a skill, and two interesting patterns emerge here. The first thing is that for each of the four groups, those with a bachelor degree are more likely to receive classroom training compared to those without a bachelor degree. Now, in some cases, this difference is smaller and statistically significant, but you can identify that pattern for all the four groups. The largest difference between those with and without a bachelor's degree emerges for white Canadian-borns, where those with a bachelor degree are 32 percentage points more likely to receive classroom training compared to those without a bachelor's degree. Now, the other interesting thing that you find here is that if you look at visible minority immigrant men, both those with and without a bachelor degree are less likely to receive classroom training compared to the reference group, which in this case is white Canadian-borns without a bachelor degree. So even visible minority immigrants with a bachelor degree are less likely to receive classroom training compared to white Canadian-borns without a bachelor degree. So this could be partly attributed to differences in observed characteristics between immigrants and Canadian-borns, because they're on different, that could put them on different career path or hierarchical levels. So to the extent that we can test this, WES includes a very rich set of variables. We include a lot of those in our regression. These variables include things like proportion of workers in higher earning categories, whether the worker supervises employees on a day-to-day basis, the number of employees supervised, so on and so forth. It doesn't really change our results much. It reduces it a little bit. We also control for whether the worker has been promoted or not, because you might think that that also affects the probability of training. It reduces the gap a tiny bit, but it's still large and statistically significant. The other thing we'll look at is for-profit versus non-profit sector. There's very interesting evidence that suggests that that non-profit sector provides better opportunities for skill development and wage equity. There are also smaller wage disparities in non-profit sector by race, by sexual orientation, and by ethnicity. And there are some studies that suggest this partly has to do with the fact that has to do with the job characteristics in this sector. Interestingly, what we find here is that most of the gap we observe economy-wide is driven by the gaps experienced by visible minorities in the for-profit sector. If you look at the non-profit sector, there is not much of a gap in probability of receiving classroom training. So this entire gap emerges out of the disadvantages they experience in the for-profit sector. Now, of course, you've got to be careful about the issue of sorting and all that, so this is by no means causal. The last thing we do is we would like to see whether these differences in training, they also contribute to the wage differences. between Canadian-borns and visible minority immigrants. So we do a standard OACA decomposition here. What we find is that, and this is what I was talking about, so if you look at the raw difference in wages between male visible minority immigrants and white Canadian-borns, that's about 16%. For women, the difference is almost half. It's about 7%. Now, out of this 16% differences in training experienced by these two groups explains about 0.8 percentage points of that difference, which is about 5%. For women, it explains something about 11% of the difference. Now, that might seem a little bit small, but keep in mind that this is based on differences in training over the last 12 months. Now, if this accumulates over time, this could make a significant contribution to these differences in wages. The last thing we do is we also look at the effect of these differences in class, well, not the effect of differences, but the effect of classroom training on promotion opportunities. We find that on average, those who receive classroom training are 3.4 percentage points more likely to get promoted. For visible minority immigrants, though, both those who receive classroom training and those who do not receive classroom training are basically, for those who receive classroom training have the same probability of promotion of those white Canadian-borns who do not receive classroom training. Those visible minority immigrants who do not receive classroom training are significantly less likely to receive promotion compared to white Canadian-borns without classroom training. So it seems that receiving classroom training does not really, although it does contribute to sort of upward mobility, but for visible minority immigrants, there are still serious barriers that they face. Sorry, I went over time.